Welcome to Geopolitical Horizons, the podcast from thegeopolity.com. My name is Nizar and I am the managing editor at The Geopolity. A decade ago this week, a Tunisian street vendor became the spark that set the Middle East alight. What began with a single man in the markets of North Africa spread to thousands on the streets in Egypt and evolved to hundreds of thousands, demanding political change for the entire region. The impact of the Arab Spring is still being felt in a number of countries, and across the world there appears to be different views on what took place a decade ago. Here to discuss this with me is the Geopolity's founder, Adnan Khan. Okay, Adnan, how are you? You alright?
I'm good. I'm doing good. Yourself?
Not too bad. Okay, let's fire away with the first question. A decade on, how would you summarize where the Middle East is today?
Okay, yeah. So that's a very broad question. I think the best way to really look at this is there are some things that are different today, and there are a number of things which really remain the same. So you see the fear that people held in the Middle East, a lot of that has gone now. So a decade ago, we saw uprisings in a number of countries. These uprisings have actually continued, demonstrations have actually continued, and this was something you didn't do in places like Libya, in places like Syria, in places like Egypt. You also see in a number of countries the rulers have gone. Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali of Tunisia, he was thrown out of power and he's passed away now. Similar with Hosni Mubarak and Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen, he's also gone now as well. However, there are a number of things that actually remain the same. So we see across the Middle East, a lot of the underlying systems still remain in place. You look at Egypt, the military is still in power. The military was in power over a decade ago as well. In Tunisia, the old guard are all back in power. These were the same people that shared rule with Ben Ali over a decade ago. And you also find that a lot of the economic, social, and political problems that were really the underlying reasons that caused the uprising in the first place, a lot of them are really still there. Many of them haven't changed, and in fact, in a number of cases, they're actually far worse today. So yes, some things have changed, but many of the things people rose up to overthrow, to change, you see a lot of them really are still there today, a decade on.
I mean, you mentioned Egypt and Tunisia. These are the two countries we saw the emergence of Islamic political parties. So how would you assess their performance?
So absolutely, no doubt, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Al-Nahda in Tunisia, both parties were long advocates of Islamic rule. They both emerged victorious a decade ago in local elections, and really was quite stunning victories for the region. However, you find today none of these two parties are in power, which actually tells you how things have actually turned out. So if we look at this in detail, obviously Egypt, it's a military security state. The army has for long been in power, controls a large chunk of the economy. That was the country the Muslim Brotherhood emerged victorious in. In Tunisia, you had a secular leadership. You effectively had a security state as well. And that was the state of Tunisia when Al-Nahda emerged victorious. So there was a number of challenges both of these parties faced in these countries. Probably the most important of them was they emerged in countries where they already existed entrenched systems. Both countries had an elite, and they had a security architecture that protected the status quo. So this was something both parties were going to have to deal with, and both of them really went down the compromise route. Both parties felt that if they compromised, if they got some agreements, if they
But
gave
didn't
up.
they overthrow the system?
No, so what you find in both countries is, if you take the example of Egypt, 88-year-old leader was overthrown, and that was basically it. The system remained, the parliament remained, the constitution remained, most of the civil service remained in power. All that really changed was the caretaker of the system, who sits at the top, that changed, and that was obviously Mohammed Morsi, that was the Muslim Brotherhood. In Tunisia, the government, the leaders of the government changed, and I think it's really debatable in the case of Tunisia if Al-Nahda even had an agenda of uprooting the whole system. So both parties went down the route of compromising in the hope that they could navigate the challenges that they could navigate the challenges that they would face. And Nahda, in the end, I think 2014, they even abandoned Islamic politics, where they publicly announced that they're now a national party. They're not really an Islamic party. The other challenge both parties faced was none of them actually presented an Islamic program or what the Islamic policies were. So there were obviously a number of challenges in these countries: economic, political, social. None of these parties presented a program or a plan of which Islamic principles did they plan to actually implement, and how were they planning to deal with some of the problems in these countries. Now, what's surprising is both of these parties won at the electoral polls, which means that they had public support. These parties have been around for a long time, decades, so they were known to be Islamic parties. So this wasn't some party that's emerged out of nowhere. But despite that, there was no clear program from them. Then we also find both parties really struggle to deal effectively with their opponents. So they came to power in countries where you had an existing system, you had established political parties and personalities, and they really failed to deal with their opponents. In fact, they played a very, very weak hand despite having public support by the elections. So we know in many historical examples where an individual or a party comes to power where the system is already entrenched, they usually carry out some sort of purge. So the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran in 1979, he purged the army because he felt the army was completely loyal to the previous ruler, the Shah. Erdogan, when he came to power in Turkey early 2000s, he carried out quite a wide purge, but he used successive electoral victories in order to actually achieve that. And the final point really is there doesn't seem to be, now looking back over the last decade, any plan really to fundamentally change the system. In fact, both Al-Nahda and Muslim Brotherhood look more like evolutionary parties rather than revolutionary parties. And the challenge was always going to be the established elite in these countries who benefited from the system, who effectively constructed the system. The last thing they're going to want to see is the system being uprooted and the interest being lost. And a decade on, it seems both of these parties didn't really have any agenda to deal with the fundamental system. So, in summary, Muslims who were for long oppressed, they gained power in these two countries, Egypt and Tunisia, but Islam never really made it into governance and was never really implemented.
Okay, when you said earlier, Muslim Brotherhood and Nahda, they were evolutionary, not revolutionary. That's quite subtle. What do you mean by that?
So revolutionary would be you've got the existing system and the plan is to completely uproot it and replace it with a new system. So the uprooting
an Islamic system.
Yeah, so what would have been revolutionary is a new constitution which is based on Islamic principles, new economic policies with Islamic policies, for example, the changing of the currency, dealing with wealth distribution in these countries. The Islamic principles or Islamic rules would have actually been applied. What actually happened was they came to power. It took about 3 or 4 years for a new constitution to be written and passed in Tunisia. And most of it really just maintained the pre-Arab Spring constitution in the first place. In Egypt, there was no discussion of the constitution anyway. There was never a discussion of uprooting parliament, changing all the legislation, and even a new constitution altogether. So really, these parties, the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in Egypt, they took a more evolutionary approach. So, for example, their argument was, if we implement the Islamic economic system, we're going to end up scaring international investors. If we implement the Islamic foreign policy, we're going to scare the international community. If we apply other Islamic precepts, we may get shut off from international institutions. So these were the sort of arguments and thinking they had regarding implementing Islam. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood obviously has been calling for Islam really since its origins, which is in the 1920s. So they got to power as individuals, but Islam never did in the end. So they got to power, Islam was never applied, and they struggled to really deal with the economic and social challenges, which was what caused the Arab Spring. In the end, obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood lost power. A coup was done against them literally on their 1 year anniversary. And in Tunisia, the Ennahda party gave up power in the end anyway, because they saw the writing was on the wall.
Okay, when a few times you said that um, both both Islamic parties they made compromises. They came to power. They made compromises, but why would who would they compromise with? Because they both won popular support from the people. Why would they make compromises? They're already in power, and who would they? For what purpose would those compromises exist?
Mm. So they both came to power in countries where for long the rule had been largely secular. You had secular rulers, you had dictators, you had a political base for these secular rulers who acted as their support base. So they took power in countries where a number of individuals and groups and institutions uh, were uh, were the support base for these type of rulers. So they came to power, and rather than play a strong hand, they came into power playing a weak hand from the very beginning. It's like they forgot you've just been elected, which is not anything the previous leader can even claim. In both countries, you had parliamentary elections, and then you had elections for the presidency itself. And in both of them, the Islamic parties won. However, what they did is they felt the best strategy to navigate the entrenched system was by compromising on some of their messages or delaying the implementation of some of their policies until the environment was more suitable. In the end, what ended up happening was the existing system got them to give up so much of their message that very little of their message remained in the end. And then the public fell out of, they lost confidence in these groups in the end because they talked about implementing Islam, but when it come to implementing it, none of it really ever got done. So in the end, they lost a lot of credibility to the point where they lost the mass support they had, which is quite surprising considering, in probably the first free or largely fair elections in the region, they actually won at the polls.
Mm. So in a sense, when they came to power, they recognised there was a system that was still entrenched there, and that's why they felt the need to compromise because they felt the system hadn't been fully removed, but they had to make compromises to stay in power, essentially. So they were still accepting the authority of that entrenched system that hadn't been removed, and that's why they made the compromises. Yeah.
Yeah, so in the case of Egypt, the security services, really, the Secret Service and the army, they maintained the existing system. And keep in mind, Hosni Mubarak was an army man. So although the army facilitated his departure, the army still maintained its position. So it seems now, looking back, the Muslim Brotherhood had never really done any work with the army. They had a relationship with the army, which was, it was quite antagonistic if you look at historically. But there was no work done with armed personnel. There was no work even done by the Muslim Brotherhood, it seems, to even get their members to join the army, work their way up the structure. This is how you find, Gamal Abdel Nasser and his free officer, this is how they managed to get into a key position in the army. So you find that before they even got into any position remotely close to implementing their agenda, there was a whole host of pillars of the existing system that had to be dealt with. And these are things you would have thought they would have thought about and studied in depth and had plans to deal with when they came to power. But it seems they didn't. And really, the system made them compromise even more of their message to the point where in the end, there was no message really.
Mm. I mean, it seems with the Arab Spring, it's never black and white. You never ever have two sides. And if you look at Arab Spring throughout North Africa and Middle East, you have on the one hand you've got international powers who interfere, but at the same time you have the regimes who are so entrenched, and the Arab Spring is having to push against both. It's stuck between a rock and a hard place, against international powers and against entrenched systems, the entrenched regimes. So in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, we now see chaos and civil wars. So has the Arab Spring been a failure? Looking at the number of deaths, etc.
Okay, that's a very interesting question because I see on social media a lot of this is it's a key discussion, and I would really say the Arab Spring, it hasn't failed necessarily, it just hasn't succeeded yet because it's still taking shape, it's still playing out in different forms and shapes. So I wouldn't say it's failed, it's still going on, it just hasn't actually succeeded yet. What we really saw a decade ago was really just the first part. And we've got to keep in mind here is that a lot of the Middle East, it has systems that were established in the wake of World War One, where Britain and France established monarchies to protect their strategic interests. So the monarchies, mainly their job was to control their own populations and to protect Western interests. After World War II, the US effectively inherited this system and it replaced some of the monarchies with army individuals. So the problem you really have in the Middle East, which is still there today, a decade later, is you have a system which isn't really representative of the people. You have a system which is more representative of Western strategic interests and then a handful of families and their friends and their support bases to maintain their own physical position. So this will continue. There will be more uprisings and this will keep taking shape until the people get a system which actually represents them. So yes, round one, they haven't succeeded, but it's not actually over yet. The other thing I think we should just keep in mind is uprisings, revolutions, they don't necessarily follow a straight line in a linear position. Yeah, we wouldn't say to the European settlers in the 1700s they shouldn't they shouldn't really do a revolution against the British Empire and establish the United States of America because there might be some chaos. So yes, there's been deaths in uprisings, but that's never a reason not to do an uprising. We wouldn't say to the people in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, or East Germany that they shouldn't have risen up against the Soviet Union in the 1980s because there might be some violence. Because on that basis, you would never have a revolution, you'd never have an uprising. Change, historically, you will see it is bloody. And the reason why it's bloody is because you have an entrenched establishment who don't want to give up power. But as you mentioned, the number of deaths, there are two main reasons why we've seen a lot of violence. Number one is, firstly, you see with the uprisings in the Arab Spring, the people really took to the streets and started demonstrating to show that they've had enough of their rulers and the system. So you can still find these videos online of people protesting, people singing, people carrying banners. It was the rulers who resorted to brutal crackdowns and violence in order to protect their position. And naturally, if the crackdown is going to be brutal, you've got to protect yourself. But it wasn't the people who went about burning cars and attacking military facilities or government facilities. It was actually the other way around. A lot of it was the rulers really who started that. And secondly, what we've seen is foreign interference. The Middle East is a strategic location, and we find very quickly foreign nations, global powers and even regional powers. They all get involved in the different countries and they back different factions. They armed them, they funded them in order to achieve their own strategic goals. And unfortunately, what this did was it created a big mess. And really, that's what's happened in Syria. You find within 1 year from when the uprising started, Bashar al-Assad, the ruler, had actually given up regaining the north of the country. And what you find is regional countries got involved. They backed different rebel groups, militias, Western nations, global powers got involved. In the end, these rebel groups and these militias all started fighting each other rather than fighting the regime. And these are the two main reasons, really, why we've seen a lot of violence.
I mean, you mentioned foreign powers back different factions. Today, in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, other countries where civil wars are taking place. What has been the role of foreign powers there?
So in the countries you're talking about, really, the reason why there even is civil wars is the involvement of foreign powers. So if we start with the example of Syria, what you find is Turkey got involved, Saudi Arabia got involved, Qatar got involved, Iran got involved, and then a whole host of global powers got involved. So you had the US, you had Russia, you had Britain, you had France, all of them actually got involved. But what you find is, despite the rhetoric of regime change should take place in this country, none of these countries undertook or did the actions that were to the level where regime change could actually take place. So if we take the example of Turkey, Turkey backed some of the rebel groups in the north of Syria. It set up the Syrian National Congress (SNC), and Turkey just remained involved in the north of the country. It never gave the weapons or the capability to the rebel groups to launch an assault on Damascus to overthrow the regime. You find the same with Saudi, Qatar, Jordan. They backed through arms and finance small groups, but they never gave them the weapons that would actually make a difference on the actual battlefield. And just to give a simple example, the US provided the Taliban back in the 1980s. It provided them with Stinger missiles, which are surface-to-air missiles, which caused big hole in the Soviet Union presence in the country. The Russian involvement in Syria was largely via the air, but you find that the militia groups and the rebel groups, none of them really received surface-to-air missiles, even rudimentary surface-to-air missiles, which would actually make a difference. So the point I'm making is the rhetoric from these countries, and when you compare them to the action they did, they're completely worlds apart. And really, considering Syria is the heart of the Middle East, if real change came to Syria, it would have a big impact on the Arab Spring. It would probably spread throughout the region. It would question the credibility of the Turkish model, the Saudi model, the Iranian model. So despite the rhetoric and the tension between some of these countries, they were largely in agreement that for them it's not good if the regime fell in Syria, because it will raise issues of credibility of their systems. But more importantly, change in Syria wouldn't stop there. It would go further in the region. So it really took the regional powers and the international powers to make sure that didn't happen. And we're in a situation today where the country is completely burnt to the ground, Syria that is. Qatar has gone back. Turkey is still on the border area, but it's removed a lot of its troops from there. Saudi's gone back. British troops have gone back. The American troops are in the region, but they've left. So really 10 years on, Bashar's still there, although he's sitting on a burnt country. So unfortunately, what you find is the different nations getting involved. In the case of Syria, it poisoned the country's uprising. And you find similar thing happen in Libya, in Yemen as well.
Mm. When you say so going back to Syria for a second, you mentioned how international powers they interfered. There was rhetoric and speeches from politicians who said there would be a red line if President Assad crossed a certain red line if he did certain actions. When he did, international powers didn't step in to do anything. So on the one hand, there was rhetoric, there was all talk from international powers, but the actions showed something else. So a very good example was, like you said, to do with air power. A lot of the rebel groups were armed with infantry fighting weapons, but what they needed was air defense weaponry, and they didn't have that. But then when you switch over to the case of Libya, European and Western powers had no problem in creating a no-fly zone over Libya to sort of neutralize Gaddafi's air force. They created a no-fly zone over Libya, thereby helping the rebel groups there. But when it came to Syria, the opposite actions take place. So in a sense, we have a basis on how to look at the politics, which is look at the actions of the governments, look at the weapons they supply, and the types of weapons they supply, and that gives an idea as to their real policies. So they can talk the talk about Syria, about them supporting the revolution or supporting the Syrian people, but the practical support of weaponry and things like this, for where it actually counts in terms of dealing with Assad's air force, his helicopters, even if they're old, he had a lot of old tech, didn't he? Very old, sort of Soviet era air power. So any amount of air defense would have helped the rebels, and none of that was provided. So I found that quite interesting, really.
So yeah, that's actually a very good insight into the difference between both countries, Syria and Libya. In Syria, you find, despite a number of issues where there were differences between the powers, you find there were an agreement that the system in Syria had to remain, whether it's Bashar or not. So the security services, the Ba'athist Party, it seemed the agreement was they have to remain. Whoever sits at the top can come and go. But obviously no system is one person. In Libya, we have a bit of a different political dynamic. This is a country that has been under European influence for a long time. It's also a key energy destination for Europe as well. Europe is trying to reduce its dependency on Russian energy, and the alternatives really are Libyan oil and Algerian gas. So when Gaddafi was overthrown, you find the Britain and France very quickly established a transitional government, which turned into a permanent government. And a lot of these individuals they worked with were former Gaddafi era individuals. But you find the US sensed an opportunity in Libya. Gaddafi for long had backed European interests. He funded and armed militia groups who pursued European interests throughout Africa. So America saw a very good opportunity to interfere in the country and try and establish a regime which is more loyal to America. The problem America had, it didn't really have any ground support in Libya. So they managed to get Khalifa Haftar, who was someone who was kicked out of Libya by Gaddafi in the 80s. He lived down the road from Langley for about 20 years, and he was inserted into Libya right at the beginning. And he's been working to rally support. He supports the second government in Libya. There's actually two or three governments at the moment in Libya. However, he's been unable to take over Tripoli, which is the political hub of the particular country. So in Libya, what you've got is you've got a battle between Europe and the US for the country. So that's why you'll find that they are providing sufficient weaponry, high-grade weaponry to their supporters. In Syria, there wasn't this type of battle or struggle going on. You find they're on the same side. It was really about ensuring none of the rebel groups get to a point where they can actually overthrow the actual regime. So again, it shows you this is why foreign interference was such a problem, because when the West got involved under the guise of we're coming to help you, we're trying to stop a slaughter happen in these countries, really they were pursuing the strategic goals, and the rebel groups and the militia groups were a means to actually achieve them. So the people rose up to remove the system, but these individual countries got involved to use the uprising for their own strategic goals.
So earlier you said that Libya traditionally, well, Gaddafi traditionally supported European interests for Africa, but most people would say he was a champion of Africa. So how do we understand that?
Yeah, so you find in the case of Gaddafi, he did have his own agenda to be the king of Africa, to be this individual who changed the plight of Africa. However, you find it was Tony Blair who ensured the neocons didn't do regime change after 9/11 in Libya. It was actually Tony Blair who made sure Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons or his biological program, because the neocons in America saw that as a potential threat and actually a reason for regime change. So obviously there's a whole history here of Libya, how the country came about and what they did. But you find there's a reason why the people rose up in Libya. They rose up because he was a brutal ruler. He had a very small support base in the country, but for a lot of people, he was a brutal dictator. In fact, many people came out of prisons when Gaddafi fell. There were people who'd been in prison for 30, 40 years under Gaddafi's torturous regime. So like a lot of rulers in the region, they always present themselves as individuals who have these grand plans to make change for people. Things will never be the same again. But what you find is a lot of this really stays on paper. In reality, they are really only concerned about their thrones and what they need to do in order to maintain their thrones. So Gaddafi ran a torturous regime, a mass killing machine actually, to maintain his actual position. Obviously, he had a support base, so he had to keep them happy. So he made promises of having the best healthcare system in the world. He used the country's wealth to satisfy them. But most of the population, as far as he was concerned, like many of the rulers in the region, the people are a threat that could remove him from his position. So you find they have a national security system in place to spy on their own people and to make sure they don't get into a position where they can overthrow them. But what the rulers are now realizing the hard way is you can oppress the people, but if the people's basic needs aren't being fulfilled and you keep oppressing them, they will eventually revolt. And we've seen this across the world in history as well.
So what about Yemen?
So unfortunately, what we've seen in Yemen is not very different to what's taken place in Syria and Libya. Like Syria and Libya, Yemen is turning more and more into a regional international struggle. The situation in Yemen is you've got the Houthis, who are an indigenous people of that country, and for long they've been ruled over by a ruling clique who have oppressed them. So when the Arab Spring started in the region, they took the opportunity to bring change into that country. And what you saw was a battle take place in that country between the ruling elite trying to maintain the status quo and the Houthis who came down from the mountains in order to overthrow them. Now, Yemen's been quite a key country in the region because you've had terrorists who have been present there. You've obviously, Yemen's got a border with Saudi Arabia, so Saudi Arabia's always taken an interest. And America and Britain have historically struggled over this strategic territory as well. So the ruling elite, Ali Abdel Saleh and his party, they came to power because Britain split united the two countries. Before it was North and South Yemen. The Houthis' plight is what America historically has backed to interfere in the country. So like Libya, the Yemen's turned into a struggle really between Britain and America by them backing different factions within the country. And unfortunately, like Libya, it's turned into a complete mess because the agenda of these countries is to take the country in a direction different to the direction the Houthis and the oppressors are trying to take it.
Why did we not see uprisings in Saudi Arabia then, the other Gulf states, Jordan, and even Pakistan? How would you explain this?
So that's a good question because you're absolutely right. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Jordan are actually in the region. And Pakistan, you've always had a struggle between the ruling elite and the people. And there's actually a number of reasons for this. So if we take the case of Saudi Arabia, when the uprising started, Mohammed bin Salman, King Salman, he had actually been in power. No, sorry, it was King Abdullah at the time, and King Salman took over. And what they did was they threw loads of money at the people. You wanted to get married, you had debts, you wanted to go abroad and study. They, in the billions, tens of billions actually, they threw money at the people to make sure the people didn't overthrow them or take the uprisings as a lesson to begin something in the country. The other thing was is they presented anyone who did demonstrate in Saudi as Shia or those backed by the Shia. So in Saudi, the east of Saudi, you have quite a large Shia population, and even when they ask for their rights, the monarchy, the Saudi monarchy, presents it as a Iranian agenda to undermine the regime. Now, the other thing also is Syria, Libya, Egypt. These are security states, police states, where the security system, the police and the army, heavily monitor, torture, imprison their own people. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, as dictatorial as they may be, they're not like these countries. So in the case of Saudi, people are not oppressed or monitored the way they are in Syria and Libya and Egypt. So that's why, in a way, the life of people, the way they live is a bit different. The other thing is that Saudi have always had this implicit understanding and agreement with their people, which is that the monarchy will provide subsidies when it comes to water, when it comes to gas, when it comes to oil. In return, you just remain loyal. So because Saudi has a lot of oil wealth, they use it to their advantage. In the case of Syria and Egypt, they don't have a lot of wealth in the first place in order to do that. In the Gulf states, you didn't really have an uprising apart from potentially there was some demonstrations in Oman. And again, the regime threw a lot of money.
And Bahrain, no?
Sorry, and Bahrain, yeah. So in Bahrain, you've got a bit of a unique setup because what you've got is a majority Shia population with a minority Sunni government. And in that case,
that come about?
Sorry?
How did that come about? In Bahrain, you have a Sunni monarchy over a majority Shia population. How did that setup come about?
So this came about in I can't remember the exact date. It was in the 1970s when Britain gave independence to the trucial states, which are the Gulf states, as we have. And what they did was they put into power minorities to rule over these small city states. And these monarchies are basically tribes who historically fought each other. So the Saud clan, the Khalifa clan in Qatar, I think it is, the rulers of Bahrain, the rulers of Kuwait, These are all small tribes used to fight each other, and that area became important. The waterways were the route you would go from Britain to British India. So Britain made deals with all of them to provide them with security. In return, it backed the tribes into power. So in the 1970s, when Britain was struggling to maintain its global position, it gave them, on paper, it gave them independence, but it left people or tribal leaders that were loyal to them in power. So this is not uncommon in the region. If you look at Iraq, the majority of the population is Shia, but the government was Sunni. In the case of Syria, you got a minority Alawi government over majority Sunni. So this was done on purpose to ensure the state would always have to, it would be weak if it wanted to expand in the region. And it also meant, the rule of the rule would be beholden to the West to maintain their actual positions. So that's why the Gulf states, they didn't really have an uprising. And keep in mind, most of the Gulf states, the indigenous population is a minority. The majority of the population in the Gulf states are expats and people from abroad. So it's unlikely foreign people in the country are going to rise up. The indigenous people, if they are going to rise up, it will be them. But the indigenous people are a minority in these countries, whether it's Kuwait, Qatar, Yemen, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE. These countries, you find that the population, the indigenous population, is a minority. Jordan was an interesting case study because in Jordan, you obviously have a monarchy and you have a government. And what the monarchy did was they dissolved the government a few times to keep the people happy. What really took the sting out of the uprising was you have an Islamic party in Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood. They're not really too interlinked into the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They're a separate branch. And what they did was they would hold demonstrations, bring the government to its knees, but then they would compromise with the king of the country. So as a result, that happened a few times, and that really took the sting out of the uprising. So that's what happened really in the countries in the region. That's why Arab Spring didn't really. And again, I would say Jordan, the Gulf states, Saudi, in terms of society, they're not really the same as Syria, Libya, and Egypt. They're not necessarily police states, despite there being some oppression. The last African country you mentioned was Pakistan. Again, a bit of a different scenario in Pakistan. There is oppression, there is poverty. But however, what you find in Pakistan is the system is not very narrow compared to the Arab world. You find the system or the establishment in Pakistan is you've got the security architecture, the military, the intelligence. You've then got the established political dynasties, the Nawaz Sharif and his family and Benazir Bhutto. And then around them, you've got lots of opportunists. You've got feudal landlords, you've got the business class. So the system in Pakistan is a lot more broader compared to the Arab world. So what you find is whenever there's an uprising in the country, the system's able to take the sting or take the pressure out of it. Because the system there is much more broader. Many opportunities are involved in the Pakistan setup. If you take the case of Libya, Gaddafi's family was the system. Everybody else was outside the system. In Egypt, you've got the military that controls most of the economy, and then there's everybody else. In Syria, you got the Ba'athists. Well, you got the al-Assad family first. You've got the Ba'athists, and then you've got the minority Alawi community. Then you've got everybody else, which is about 85% of the population. So the Pakistan system is just much more broader. So it will take more of an effort to overthrow it. And secondly, again, Pakistan is not a police state. Despite things that happen in Pakistan, it's not a police state. There is a level of openness in the country. You can criticize the government. You can ridicule the government. You can ridicule even individuals in the system. That's part of the political culture in Pakistan. In Libya, in these sort of places, you can't even criticize the leadership. You're going to get, individuals will inform of you if you actually did. So the reason why we don't see uprising in these countries is because the ground reality in terms of oppression and how the rulers manage the society is very different in these countries.
I mean, from what you're describing, it seems the future is quite bleak. So what does the future hold for the people in the region, and how do you see things playing out?
So yeah, it's unfortunate on the decade anniversary. I don't have much positive information. However, what caused the Arab Spring? The economic situation 10 years ago is what primarily drove people like Mohammed Bouazizi of Tunisia to self-immolate himself. Here's a graduate who has to sell fruit and veg on a carriage on the side of a road. Because there's no jobs, because there's no strategy to create employment, he had to basically sell fruit and veg on a market. And an altercation between the market inspector led to him to just self-immolate himself because he had no hope, he saw no future. Now, the economic situation today, a decade later, in places like Egypt and Tunisia, is far worse. So, what you find is the conditions that led to the Arab Spring 10 years ago, they are still there today and they're far worse. And if we take the example of Egypt, Egypt's got some fundamental challenges coming up that it's going to have to deal with. And the regime is showing no signs of actually tackling these. The Egyptian population now is just over 100 million people. In the next 2 decades, they're forecasting the population to be about 130 million. So that means nearly 1 million 15-year-olds will turn 16 every year until then. So 1 million new Egyptians will be joining the workforce for jobs that don't exist. And as the population increases, you need to water them, you need to house them, you need to educate them. The regime has absolutely no strategy on how to deal with this. In fact, what the Egyptian regime is doing is resorting to the old tactics of using an iron grip. And that's just an example of Egypt, but you find the demographics are only getting bigger and bigger in the region. So our rulers are resorting to the old methods of an iron grip. And that is what actually caused, because they didn't deal with the problem, the economic, social, political problems, that's what actually led to the uprisings in the first place. I think secondly, also, and finally, is, a lot of the nations we're talking about today, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen, these are artificial nations that were created by the Europeans at the time of World War I, and America inherited a lot of these after World War II. These nations are really only surviving because they're police states. The rulers, they govern over these countries with a supply line that comes from the West, as long as they protect strategic interests, and their job is really to control their own population. But with the economic challenges growing, the rulers are really going to struggle to survive in the face of discontent from the people. So really, a decade on, I'm actually quite hopeful that real change really will come to this region. I think it's actually inevitable. I think it's not an issue of if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen.
Because essentially you're saying that the source of the discontent, the source of the problems hasn't been resolved.
Absolutely. The economic problems are still there. In Egypt, it's far worse today. Tunisia, they've had, I think, 3 different governments and multiple prime ministers because they've not actually even started to deal with the challenges in those particular countries. So whilst the rulers will paper over some of these problems, they're not going away. In fact, they're actually growing in scope. And keep in mind, the rulers, these rulers are there because of the artificial countries created by the West. So these rulers are not even really there to solve the problems or to develop the nations. They're really there to maintain their own thrones. And to maintain their own thrones, they need to control their population and they need to make sure they protect the strategic interests of the West. So they're in chains. The people don't fear their rulers anymore. They're prepared to take to the streets and brave the crackdowns. On the other hand, if they don't protect Western interests, they're no longer useful for them. And that's the life of an artificial nation who has an artificial ruler.
Okay. Well, thanks for your time today, Adnan. If you want to learn more about the issues raised today, please check out our website www.thegeopolity.com, all one word. You can also learn more on other issues by accessing our website, where you'll find comprehensive insights and articles. I'm Nizar Hussain, thanks for listening.